Okay, we're going to play. Good introduction. We're going to play. Now, I must share something with you first. When I was asked to give a series of talks, I wrote down on a piece of paper all the things that I find interesting and that I reflect on. And that's why I chose these subjects. You might say they're in the process of reflecting. So I thought if I chose these subjects, since I enjoy reflecting on them, it would be an easy task to give a talk on them. But I hadn't anticipated this particular evening's assignment, which is the tragic in the comic and the comic in the tragic. It's a very interesting problem. I'd like to share first with you why I think it's so interesting, and maybe most important. First, in the description of tonight's talk, there includes a line that we're going to be dealing with Plato's dialogue, The Symposium. You see, here's Plato, great philosopher. And the conclusion of this dialogue, which has many humorous comic scenes in it, he concludes the entire dialogue with this statement. Now, what's surprising about that is why a philosopher would ever be interested in comedy and why tragedy. Maybe the tragic, but not the comic. Another thing, it is a well-known thesis that if you take any dialogue and structure it out, you'll find that the introduction anticipates the entire dialogue, and the conclusion always brings you to reflect in an interesting way on the entire dialogue, so you're forced to see it in a new way. Now, given that, how can this in any way cause us to reflect on the dialogue in a new way? Doesn't appear to have anything to do with philosophy, just tragedy and comedy. Let's take a look at it. Socrates was compelling them, that's Agathon and Aristophanes. And as you know, Agathon just won first prize for writing tragedies. And Aristophanes is the great comic poet. And they both gained great fame in their respective fields. So Socrates is compelling them to admit that the same man ought to understand how to compose both comedy and tragedy. Evidently, they didn't want to admit that, or at least one of them didn't, since he had to compel them to admit it. Then there's the second part, and that he who has skill as a tragic poet has skill for a comic poet. Well, the person who has the skill for a tragic poet, that's very clear. That is Agathon. He won first prize. Obvious. So therefore, that he who has skill as a tragic poet, Agathon, has skill for a comic poet. Well, why would he be reluctant to admit that unless there was something about what he said in the dialogue or the speech that he gave in the dialogue that was such a failure that it justified Socrates' comment? Oh, what would that be? Look here. If they both agreed readily to this, then Agathon then should have written then, or composed or gave a great speech on love. That was tragic or comic, since obviously the same person should have both skills. but he was opposing it. Well, look here. Since he gave a comic speech, perhaps there's something about the comic speech he gave which in principle showed that he failed to understand what he was doing. Well, that would mean, by the way, if this is sound, that he's not a tragic poet either. If the requirement of a tragic poet, someone who has skill for it, is that they should also be able to do the work of a comic poet. So if that's correct, then we might understand why Socrates is described in the article, in the dialogue, as not having attended the great festival and celebration of Agathon's winning the first prize for tragedies. But what has this got to do with philosophy? Let me take the other side, Aristophanes. The same man, either one, ought to understand how to compose both. Just ought to understand, not do it. Not that they have the skill to do it, they simply ought to understand how to do both. Well, if that applies to Aristophanes, and he gave what appears to be a very funny speech about the nature of love, well, perhaps there's something weak about the way he expressed his comedy. Well, or it could be that when he was writing and giving that great speech, he mixed tragic elements with comic elements, and he should not have done that. He ought to know how to compose. He ought to know how to compose, and he should have avoided that kind of situation. But what has this got to do with philosophy? What does it really do? Well, look here. Let me go another step. They're all sitting around. Everyone is, at this point, it's the end of the evening, end of the dialogue. They're all sitting in a circle, going from left to right. End of the evening, there are only 3 people left. All the others either passed out from drinking too much or left. And there are only 3 people left. And they are going around from left to right, still obeying the basic rule of the dialogue that speeches should proceed from left to right, and they're continuing to drink. And therefore, here is the comic writer, composer, here's the tragic, and here's the philosopher. Does that suggest, therefore, that we might have something like this? How would you arrange a comic figure, a tragic figure, a philosopher? Are they progressive steps? How should they be arranged? Oh, wait a minute, let's go another step. When you have 3 terms like this, they can be arranged in a mean proportion. So it could very well be that we might say comedy is to tragedy as tragedy is to philosophy. That would be a mean analogy of 3 terms. A comedy is to tragedy